You're listening to VerySpatial Podcast, episode 714, May 5th, 2023. Happy Cinco de Mayo.
Hello, welcome to a Very Spatial Podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
And this is Frank.
And this week we're going to talk, and we have three news items to start off with. And one of them is just last time we were talking about acquisitions and how, we have this kind of revolving door of acquisition. So last time we talked about Maxar being acquired by an investment group. Today we're talking about NV5, who we've talked to before, has acquired L3 Harris, who of course we've talked to before. And of course L3 Harris had acquired Excelis Viz back in the day, and Excelis had acquired IDE, or forgetting names of things. But yes, the continuation of acquisitions is a thing.
I was gonna compliment your ability to remember all these acquisitions back through the time.
IDL, there we go.
Yeah, I was going to say.
There we go. I knew you remember.
Yeah.
I'm astounded because we have been around for so many of these, mergers and acquisitions and things like that. And at some point, I don't know about you, Sue, but for me, I just start going, I can't keep track.
I know.
Of who owns
Or sometimes I'll just say one of the old ones. Like, I accidentally said GOI to somebody the other day, and they're like, whoops, wait a minute, you don't know what I'm talking about.
The satellite still exists. It has a new name.
Yes.
Different company.
Yeah, exactly.
La 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 la.
But Jesse is able to keep track. Well done.
I don't know if I can.
I mean, of all of us, you do the best job.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This time, at least, it's another geospatial firm who's buying it. But it's just, it's one of those where we clearly we're aware of NV5 because we talked with them before. But just the fact that they're a large enough entity to buy L3 Harris, which is, multinational, not just geospatial, but engineering and environmental services and all kinds of things. And it's just the size of these companies that are buying companies is just, it's outside of my context, I think. Even after all this time, I'm just like, that's just too big for my brain to comprehend.
Well, they mentioned in this particular the link in the show notes, but I've noticed that you see the terms of services and data acquisitions, and so an awful lot of these. It's kind of interesting to me that going back to closer to the beginning of the podcast when we started, there was a lot of technology acquisitions, not quite as much data holdings. Obviously, that was important and a part of it, but I always felt like they were buying new capabilities, new technologies. I shouldn't say capabilities, because data is capability, but new technology doodads. But it really does feel about data libraries are almost more important in a lot of these acquisitions, which is kind of interesting to think our data holdings have grown to the point where we can buy whole catalogs, and that's the entire point.
Yeah. And Sue, of course, was right to point out that Jesse's tired and convoluted a couple of things there. So please clarify.
Yeah, so it's not acquisition of all of L3 Harris.
Yeah.
It's their visual information solutions division. So that's the commercial geospatial technology and software that's usually referred to as Viz. And so within that, of course, are products that we know like NV and IDO and stuff like that. Yeah.
So you normally record in the morning. We're recording in the evening, and it's a long day. So I started the right direction, and then I grew unintentionally, not thinking about it. Because it's L3 Harris. Just
it is interesting they're large enough to have divisions they can just splinter off, and spin off into another company.
Yeah. So, again, though, it's the whole just acquisitions upon acquisitions thing. Just is always.
Well, and again, I think as Frank pointed out too, a recognition of just the value of the geospatial data acquisition techniques, right? Because some of those things that passed with this acquisition had to do with patents and trademarks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's just that recognition of the continued importance and growth of all of that. In another, I think, pretty cool piece of news related to data acquisition and what we can do with new technologies, a company called NewView has actually announced plans to launch a constellation of satellites, essentially to collect Lidar data to map 3D Earth, right? So to add to our abilities to do 3D mapping.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about communications or traditional optical sensors for a lot of these constellations. And more recently, we talked about some that are pushing into hyperspectral, but we haven't really talked a lot about nanosats or small sats for Lidar.
Yeah, I mean, Lidar is traditionally a plane-based platform. I mean, normally when you contract it out, at the state level or something like that, or a county, you're talking about a plane-based thing. It's kind of interesting. They'll have this potentially global part that they can sell out. They've already identified 1.2 billion with a B dollars in customers for this data. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and this will be interesting, as they noted, right? That most lidar is collected much closer to the ground, and that means it takes a longer time, and you're doing it in smaller patches, right? So I'm curious, like how they're going to actually manage the collection of so much data from so much further up, right? So remember, we've had a few of these type of 3D mapping missions. So was it TandemX TandemX and the other paired satellite that Airbus had, and some of them, using radar. So back in the old days, we all remember the shuttle radar mission. But lidar is such a huge, huge volume of data to get that, and to get that really high resolution. And I'm just really interested in how they are actually going to make this, a practical kind of system.
Yeah, we will say that the article that we have linked in the show note doesn't point to the resolution that they're going to be looking at, but
That's true.
we expect it's going to be higher than some of the other lidar satellite missions like ICESat, and there's an older one that was mapping the Amazon, also by NASA, whose name I can't remember right now. But it's not by any means a first for satellites and lidar, but it's generally been lower resolution and for very specific purposes in the past. So it's kind of curious to see what the resolution will be, and it might be in one of the press releases that we just aren't looking at right now.
Well, I mean, it sits in there that the company predicts there will be a large market for its data, which can be used by farmers to optimize crop yields, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's the level of customer they're thinking about, is the farmer, which admittedly there's big agro farms and they have millions of dollars of budgets, but still that's, pretty doggone accessible, I think. Resolution is still obviously a big issue, but they're thinking, a little more broadly on the pardon the pun, on the ground to get it to urban planners and cities and things like that. So it kind of suggests a pretty good resolution and a product that's obtainable, if you will, by normal clients. And they're saying it's going to be 1,000 times faster to collect the data than traditional aerial methods, which that's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah, I mean, because that's one of the things about lidar, right? It's just huge volume of data. It's pretty slow to collect it, and so definitely.
In a place like West Virginia, it's really important because you essentially only have two real times that you can collect, because you tend to collect imagery at the same time. So you're looking for leaf off, snow off, and that's hard to get for a lot of places. So you've got like maybe a month, twice a year that you can pull it off, depending on what's going on with the climate in that particular time. So this having, I would presume, a relatively, compared to that, constant data collection would be pretty impressive. Next up in the news, this is a little scary in a way, but hackers were able to take control of a ESA satellite, SciSat, not hackers, but a team of researchers showing that they could do the hacking of the satellite, and they were able to mess around with its GPS and its altitude, effectively, pointing it in a different place than where it's really designed to go, or tell it that it's somewhere that it isn't. And that's a little frightening to think that a group of hackers could take control of some of these satellites. But it's also, on the one hand, it feels like a mid-90s 007 plot point. On the other hand, it also feels like maybe it's astounding this hasn't happened before. But, in this particular case, we're talking about theoretically white hackers, researchers going, this is how you could do it if you were interested in doing something nefarious. And that's why they've announced this results.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we talk about something like this, it ties back to the last two things we were talking about: data acquisition satellites themselves and where we're going. And a lot of countries and private organizations are both putting satellites up, and they have a variety of capabilities. And a lot of those things, those companies or countries rely on. And whenever you get bad actors potentially in there, being able to have access to the same data for free, and then they start sharing it, so a company loses money, or a country, thinks they have certain information that is only to them, and others are looking at the exact information by hacking the system. There's a lot of things there that are of note.
They note that the way they did it was essentially going through the ground-based control systems, which obviously makes sense. There's no direct connection outside of that. There's no wire coming down from space, obviously. But it's pretty frightening to think about that we have these systems connected to an outside terminal at some level, or outside capable terminal at some level, to allow them to sort of piggyback and work their way through that route. And on the one hand, you think, how could anyone think that was a good idea? But on the other hand, you also kind of think, well, how can you can see how anyone would go, well, yeah, that's not something anyone would ever do. So I can totally see how it happened, but it is kind of frightening.
Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it just reminds us that not a lot of people necessarily know that a lot of these systems, while they have evolved, still have the same basic setup in how satellites communicate with us on Earth, right? And those haven't fundamentally changed. There have been improvements, but they really do rely on these signals that go back and forth. And if you're able to get in on the signal, I mean, there's really very little stopping you. So, but as you point out, Frank, that's kind of how we have to do it. I mean, our current technology.
If you want to lose sleep, the article also recognizes there was a leaked CIA report that suggested that China has the ability to do this to foreign satellites, or develop the capability to do this to foreign satellites. And then there was a Pentagon release examining the IT infrastructure of defense agencies in the United States, reaching a very similar conclusion. So, this sort of white hat ESA hack thing is of concern, but it's going on at apparently is going on a much bigger magnitude and much more concerning magnitude, in the so-called three-letter agencies, and that's even more frightening.
Well, I have to say, my very first experience in dealing with these types of things was back when I did my first extension for ArcGIS. We were working with some students, and it was to actually read the GPS stream and create an extension that would, basically give your location on desktop, right? And using ArcObjects and other tools. And I was just amazed that actually you could really do that, right? That you could see, was it NMEA? Yeah. That you could actually see the stream, and, if you understood what was in there, you could, in fact, get the information that a GPS receiver would get. And I remember being both amazed and surprised by that. So perhaps surprised that I made it work, but that was kind of the first time I really thought about those things.
Yeah, you kind of think, I can do that?
Yeah.
That can't be good.
It was cool, though.
To be fair,
cool.
That's what that was built for, was just to say, this is where I am, and this is the information you need.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it was amazing. Like, and of course, I was helping some students, and so the sense of accomplishment was pretty amazing at the time. But yeah, I mean, it's the first time I actually learned a lot more about how these types of things work. So,
we won't say which decade that was, but it was not anywhere near the current.
We're
decade.
old, so we can say that.
Actually, I think we can go so far as to say we won't say which century that was in.
Well, now everyone knows, because if it's not this one, there's really only one other option.
Narrowed it down the decade quite a bit there.
I think I may have.
Yes.
So yeah, but yeah, so it's all of these things are things that are going on now, and in the geospatial industry, as Sue and I get ready to take off to Japan for a couple of weeks. So I don't know, what do we want to talk about for our episode this week?
Well, I was thinking that, we could talk a little bit about a topic we've talked about many times on the podcast because it's near and dear to all of us, but haven't in a while. And I'm about to immerse myself and a a number of students that are going with us to Japan, so we're taking them on a study abroad, in some of the concepts of cultural landscape, reading cultural landscape, and understanding those things to potentially reproduce parts of that in a digital form. So, and it got me thinking, first of all, to think about some of the Japanese landscapes and what they do, as an example, right? And there's lots of examples for that, and what they do tell us maybe about what's important in the culture, or people that grow up immersed in those landscapes, what they may think about that. And one of the curious ones I was thinking about in watching some videos, as we were kind of saying, oh, we want to go to these cool places, is the interesting thing about small neighborhoods, and not just in Japan. So you probably find this a lot of places, but the interesting thing about small neighborhoods and the narrow streets that you often see, and just looking at things like signage and the fact that those places are meant for the people who live in them, and kind of really truly known local places. They don't have big flashy signs. They're not trying to attract people from the outside. And it's interesting when you see pictures or walk down through those types of places, how the importance, I think, that people place on different aspects of those neighborhoods are things that you have to know by living there or knowing someone that lives there, because it's not overtly out in the landscape. And that was one of my first things to think about in trying to pass some ideas on, and then to students. And then I thought, well, there are lots of other places where, now that I'm thinking about it, I've seen the same phenomenon.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we have the same phenomenon. We live, as the crow flies, 12 miles from Myrtle Beach, and on a road that's on either side of us by, a mile or less, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people drive by our neighborhoods every year to get to that destination. So, yeah, we can talk about Shinjuku or Shibuya, where people are, destined to go, but it's those neighborhoods they're going by, I think, that you're talking about, like ours, like the small ones that are the more residential areas.
Yeah, it's just a much more intimate definition of place. So if you're trying to understand or maybe see things about what gives, what the people that live there and actually interact with there think of as important, I think you really have to look and kind of really see, which maybe you don't when you're just passing through or out in the areas that are meant more for the passerby, the transient kind of person.
Yeah, I think the idea of a place, I'm going to move beyond a little bit, not beyond, but pull out a little bit from cultural landscape to place. It's fascinating to me when you travel to a place. Oftentimes, there is a type of traveler that, and I'm one of them, that wants to know what the locals eat. Where do they go? Where do they find interesting? What are their fascinating bits about their particular town or city or whatever it may be? And I found that most places have hidden treasures that you've got to dig to get at a little bit. And I've always found it kind of interesting that they're so hidden, right? That they're not obvious. The in the United States, places like the Applebee's or the McDonald's or something like that, they're very apparent. It's a piece of the cultural landscape that those organizations go out of their way to make sure that everyone can find without any trouble whatsoever. But the coffee shop that has the shockingly good coffee, or the bakery that makes the wonderful scones, or the little sandwich place that you would never thought of going to, they're always on hidden places, and it requires that intimate local knowledge to understand that landscape. And I think about food a lot in these contexts, because when I go places, I am much more interested in connecting to the cuisine, because I got to eat, right? And I want to eat good food. So I want to know what actually is good food here, as opposed to what is often in the United States landscape, consistent food. You go to McDonald's and you more or less know exactly what you're going to get, or Wendy's, or any place. I'm picking on McDonald's. But it's more interesting to eat the local food that's fascinating. And that's why, like, geospatial technologies like Yelp are interesting, because it does uncover some of that cultural landscape at some level.
Well, and I think, and the follow-on to that too, that I think that's a good example, right? Is I think, at least for some that I've talked about, the notion of those types of places are that they are hidden because they're not necessarily for outsiders and all that. But some of it is what I got to wondering is if it's just because with the shared identity, right, of a place like that, you don't need to have the signs to point people to it because you're maybe raised in that area, right? You spend your whole day there, so you already know. And so the lack of kind of overt, hey, come on in here and do this, isn't necessarily trying to not welcome you. It's just that it's not needed for those who already have that as part of their mental map, their worldview. And I just thought, well, that's kind of an interesting and different way to look at some of those places.
Well, I mean, you can look at some of to keep going with food, you can look at some of the downtown areas, the CBDs that exist in the United States, especially in small towns that are kind of seeing the decline as more people continue to move into urban areas. That we have these areas that are not marked, and as people do come through, they don't get business. So it's this spatial knowledge, this placial knowledge, can in turn have negative impacts on the opportunities for some of these places.
Would you
Without
call
the
it
word of mouth.
the assumption that the knowledge is there, right? And that because they hadn't needed to share it before when it was just local.
Yeah.
But now that local may have been, that local now is shifting, right? It's fewer, maybe different people. And so having to overtly say, hey, this is what's here, maybe is a change that not everybody is prepared for or perhaps doesn't want to do. I mean, there is that vein of it, but that seeing it as in the past, it wasn't necessarily needed as much because you had much more of a shared sort of maybe a smaller radius, if you will, of your daily life.
Yeah, and this is coming from watching episodes of Hometown Takeover on HGTV, and it's very much of a not planning activity. So it's kind of this weird, not geography, but not geography in terms of how they're doing these things. And it's just, I don't know, it's weird in terms of how we can look at the world like that.
Yeah. Well, it's a good example because actually it was two things, a video on a little local neighborhood in Tokyo and that particular video of that TV show, Hometown, where they were helping out a shop that didn't even have a sign out front. They said, well, some people knew where they were. A lot of people didn't, didn't have much of a sign. And then I was thinking about the little neighborhood that had, in Tokyo that had shops and restaurants and things like that. And you walk by, though, there's not a very overt presence out in the street, right? You can recognize, once you start to recognize what a shop looks like or what a ramen place looks like with the Norn curtains out and things like that, and you're like, oh, that must be what that is. But, you have to have familiarity to kind of say, hey, this is a place where going to get food and whatnot.
Yeah, I was thinking of we went to a Cuban, VerySpatial as a whole went to a Cuban restaurant in New York City that I think was to this day some of the best Cuban food I've ever had outside of Florida, and it was just amazing. But it was a door, and you walked in, and it went back like a corridor for longer than I would have thought of, and it opened up into a much more expansive restaurant, and then much bigger in the back that you could sit and eat, and it was astounding. But again, it was a door, an innocuous door that you would not have thought anything about in any level whatsoever, had it not been for a digital device telling me there's a restaurant here and it's really good. And I went, okay. And we went and it was very good. But that's example of that sort of hidden gem that you wouldn't even think about uh, um, engaging in at any level unless you had that local knowledge. Then I was thinking about another thing. I'm going to segue a little bit here for a second, just so people understand how I got here. But my coworker, one of my new coworkers, was talking. We were talking about daylight savings time, and if you've been around me or listened to podcasts for any length of time, you'll know that I abhor the clock changes, and I will go into large, long, and lengthy expletive-filled rants on why it's terrible. But an interesting cultural thing is, if you've ever watched movies from the 40s or the 50s set in the United States, you'll see an awful lot of mostly 40s, but people will say, "Hey, buddy, you got the time?" You hear that a lot. And I always grew up assuming that was because like people just didn't carry watches or, they forgot to wind it properly or something like that. And that's not really why that was a prominent way of interacting when you got into a new location. The reason is because for a period of time from World War II until 59, no, early 50s, whenever the Daylight Savings Act standardization went into effect, everybody could do their own time. They could switch time whenever they wanted to, and literally every town could have a slightly different clock. There was probably the most egregious example of that is if you took a bus from Pittsburgh to Cleveland, which I think is like a 3-hour drive, you went through 8 or 9 clock changes just because all the localities had slightly different time. So you had to ask, what's the local time? And I was thinking about that with regard to like food. And that's another phrase that you see in a lot of old movies that you just don't engage in much here in the United States anymore is somebody getting off a train or a bus or getting out of a car and saying, "Hey, what's good to eat around here?" And that sort of trade of local knowledge. Locality is going, you can go to this place and it's got this, or you can go to that place and it's got this type of food. That is, in my opinion, a little less common than it appears to be, at least in pop culture from the era. And I think it's because we've kind of standardized on the existence of these things that are predictable. And we don't tend to engage with the public and ask, hey, what is good that's local around here?
I would agree, but also point out the fact that we have a large now, and I think it's safe to say growing foodie culture, and a lot of it has moved online. So it may be less about asking rather than going back to what you were talking about earlier with Yelp or Google Maps or whatever service you like, finding out of the way places that way, or TikTok or Twitter or wherever you go to find things. So I think in our story driven culture that maybe we're missing out on some of that dialogue, but the information's still there.
Yeah, I think the information is there, but one of the big changes has been that whenever you engage with a locality, you're getting local knowledge because they're locals. When you engage with the cloud, it may or may not be. It could be somebody else like you who just are passing through. Hey, I ate here; it was great. Owner was wonderful. Still valuable information, but it is slightly different tint to it.
And I think that that's really interesting. I just started thinking about this example, right, of uh, kind of taking it then as an isolated experience rather than, you know, organically discovering for a lot of people, right? It becomes a checklist thing, which is nothing wrong, right, to come visit and get great food, but by maybe learning a little bit more about the neighborhood that you discovered in or something like that, that's a different experience than just saying, all right, here's my top 5 restaurants. This one's this far away. Um, and, just in and out kind of thing maybe doesn't give you the same picture of the cultural landscape in which those places, amazing places, are embedded. And, maybe some of the interesting thing about why they're there, right? Groups from different places that have settled in certain, say, city neighborhoods and, all of the rich history behind that, or, um, you know, lots of other things that can kind of play into it. And, sometimes you don't get that if, as you say, Frank, you don't interact with the locals and kind of, see, or, even yourself, if you think about your identity in your local place and maybe, passing that on to someone else, maybe it's a different experience now. They're just, they might stop you on the street to say, so Yelp says there's this great restaurant 2 blocks from here. Just can you point me to it, kind of thing, rather than, kind of a more casual interaction.
We also run into the no data, no geography problem, right? Which is, we were talking about food, and obviously, again, food's something we all have to have regularly. So there's a lot of infrastructure that's built around the dialogue of food. But I was just thinking about like when we used to go to San Diego for the Ezra UC, we went probably at least 2 or 3 years before we started renting a particular condo that we would go to most years. Before that, I didn't know just close to the venue where the UC is located at, and a couple blocks away, is this little dog park. This little park that's, you know, a lot of people, myself included, have a yard that's bigger than this entire park. But it's devoted to a particular dog that used to go there a lot, and it's a cute little thing, and it's a nice little place to sit, and it's kind of this quiet spot in the Gaslight District in San Diego. If it wasn't for the fact that we just happened to walk by it because of the place we were renting, we went a particular route. I was like, "Oh, this is kinda cool that that's there." I don't know how you would discover that easily if you're, traveling through San Diego, if it wasn't for the fact that there was spatial proximity that allowed that to happen for us. And I don't know that the tools are out there necessarily to communicate that as clearly as certainly something like a Yelp. And that's, again, another piece of the cultural landscape. And there's a whole story behind that little park, and it's kind of cute, but it's not a piece of the cultural landscape you would interact with unless you accidentally found it.
A lot of our conversations around this revolve around Minority Report or how businesses are going to do this. But I mean, there's a lot of opportunities, whether it's augmented reality or not, to be able to insert some of this kind of background information, maybe we could call it. But, a lot of us are using wearables of different sorts, everything from, Amazon glasses to a watch to, whatever you might have that isn't necessarily a visual thing, that there are still a lot of opportunities for location-based services on those for kind of passive feed of information that you can subscribe to. I want to know whenever I'm within 100 feet of X, Y, or Z, whether that be a type of restaurant, a type of park, a type of shop, if that's, what you're interested in, that we just haven't seen a lot of that being done yet. And I think it does go back to what you're saying, that it's somewhat a dearth of information. Not that the information spatially isn't there, but it hasn't been kind of brought together in such a way that it's good for disseminating. So, having a location and then linking out to its Wikipedia page is not what I want to hear if I, am walking by something and it pops up on my, overlaying over my music or something. So it's just maybe not. We're still waiting to see content, I guess, being generated around some of this information.
And I'm going to use a term that's going to make too bad it's an audio medium we're in, because you really get to see Jesse's eyes roll really hard. In some ways, this screams for like a deep map. So a sort of thick embodiment of different information layer on top of each other, and then trying to connect it probably through space um, in some meaningful way, and a meaningful set of tools that allow you to engage with that thick description without, having it annoy the crap out of you. Like Jesse says, you listen to music. I don't even bother. I don't care. I'm listening to music. But get it to me in some form or fashion that might be meaningful. And having that thick, robust description. So earlier today, as an aside, earlier today I was reading a thread on there's a for guitar stuff. It's called the Gear Page, and they were complaining about a particular company called or a particular guitar shop called Righteous Guitars, because it's very normal within the guitar world to have a discount. You go in and the price, it's like getting a car, in the United States at least. There's a price is this, but you're probably going to negotiate it lower. How much you can and can't, it's going to depend on whatever place. But Righteous Guitars apparently is quite well known for no discount. And people are complaining about that because you can buy on the internet at a discount from one of a bazillion places in the United States or Europe if you wanted to do that. But what a lot of people who are in Atlanta, what a lot of people were saying about the store is this store is devoted to a sort of a boutique, concierge, high quality, service orientated, all that kind of stuff. And it's just a different type of guitar buying experience. And when you're talking about that stuff, with a wearable, I'm like, I wonder how you would communicate that. If I go to this guitar store, realize, oh, you're going to pay full price, but you're going to get a really high end experience, which may or may not be valuable for you. But there's no way you would ever know that, because the cultural norm within guitar shops is, okay, what can you do for me on this price wise? And that's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know how you get that thick description out to all those different venues that you can engage with in a locality.
Well, I think that's why trying to first understand the layers of cultural landscape, and then think about for those of us who work in this digital world, trying to filter those stories, reproduce them, present them in a format, right, that's still immersive, right? And so I think that's probably one of the questions that's at the crux of it is how do you do it? And we've had years now to try in various ways. There's been lots of advances and starts and stops, and I don't think we've solved it. But it's still interesting, right? Because every time you can bring up the topic, you think of that another layer that, plays into cultural landscape, and another experience that you have that becomes a touchstone to say, well, how would I present this to someone else, or how would I be able to experience this in a different place, right? And so, I think that conceptually think about it, the idea of thick description and deep mapping, right? But there's always something more that we can know, always another layer. And so already you're kind of at you're almost overwhelmed with the various things. And every time you go back, even to the same landscape, right, there's something different there. And so I think it is a huge challenge, but also I think it's really an enriching experience to just each time, think about those things that you see in a landscape. And that's why I kind of kicked off with the example I did, because I just never had kind of framed the thought of little neighborhoods like that. And I grew up in a small town full of little neighborhoods, and I just thought, well, I grew up with that knowledge in this place. But when I've showed it to others, I've always been pretty proud of a lot of little things, but I'm like, no, you wouldn't necessarily see that, and I have to explain it. And maybe sometimes I don't, and I want to do it anyway. But I think it plays into all of the examples that we've been talking about, is just how rich cultural landscapes are, how much they can tell us. But since so many things are layered, the question is, how do you pick them out, and pick them out in something that's still coherent?
And related to this is positionality, right? Is that how are they the space, the place has a cultural landscape in itself, right? But it has to mean something to you, or it has to connect to you. Otherwise, it's just an interesting bit of trivia, or not interesting bit of trivia. There's just factoids. And there's got to be a way that that gets related to you in a meaningful way. So, like you said, so you grew up in a relatively small town, and there's a lot of interesting cultural landscape there. But if I don't know Sue, what do I care? That doesn't really matter to me meaningfully. So you have to make that connection. And that's even the harder part at some level, not just how do we collect it? How do we synthesize it? How do we put it in a meaningful depiction? How do we communicate it? How do I make it relevant for you personally as you walk by? The Jesse threw out the Minority Report example, which is a great example, but that one of the signs as he walked by the Gap, I think it was, and it said the pants you like are on sale. Well, the pants you like are on sale. That's the important bit there. Not the fact that there are pants on sale. That doesn't really matter. But the ones that you like buying a lot happen to be on sale. You got to connect that. And I think that's even to my mind, that's a even bigger, a more massive problem. I mean, if we solve that other stuff, it's even bigger to figure out, how do I connect that to you and deal with the inherent privacy question associated therein.
This brings us back to the topic I wanted to do last episode, which I got waved off on by Dr. Bergeron, of looking at AI. And eventually we have to have this conversation. I mean, we've avoided it now for 4 months, 5 months.
Or we can let the AI have the conversation.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not like we haven't talked about AI for years in terms of the context of remote sensing. It's just a different context that we need to talk about it in this case. But I mean, that's where it comes in, is we have these generators that will choose the voice you need to hear then. And I use voice there as metaphorical because it can be audio, it can be visual, it can be textual, which is still visual, but all these different ways of information being conveyed to us as we're walking by, and our selected device, whether it's our watch, our phone, our earbuds, or whatever, eventually our AR glasses once we have better versions. But all that comes back to the non-eye roll. I just want to point out non-eye roll about the thick description, because again, yes, deep mapping in the book it was originally discussed in was not clearly defined, and that was intentional, I believe.
Yeah, it was.
That, it is a multivocal thing, and that brings us back more to that cultural aspect within the landscape. There's multiple voices, and the content that's being generated is being generated by multiple voices. So now it's that process that Frank is asking about, how do we do this? It's probably going to come back around to AIs who are looking for the stories that we want. But that gets us away from the big AIs like ChatGPT and others and looking at more of the specialized AIs. I'm forgetting names. But the ones that you can basically install on your own server, begin to feed in information about you and your preferences, and have it responding in ways that are appropriate to you, as opposed to the more generalized that, the big, they're still taking advantage of these text databases that they're being trained on, but then you're feeding them about you. And so there's a little bit more of that continuity of you in it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a real linchpin, right? So I've complained for years now that, um, look, if you're going to profile me, get one thing right. I don't care about sports, so stop showing me anything that has anything to do with sports. Don't tell me that I also get 127 ESPN channels. Don't care. Don't care. I'll never care. There's no math that's ever going to be true. As you can tell, this irritates me.
Well,
That
it'll still be true. You just don't care.
Well, it's again, it's where you want the personal AI to go, look, you can tell him that all day long. You're just going to irritate him. Just don't bother mentioning it because it's not relevant to his worldview. However, if you want to tell me that some important thing happened in Star Trek in theoretically in the future, that's a cool factoid. I do want to know about that because I'm a big old nerd. That's the type of thing where it needs to own itself to your particular, view of the world, which again brings up, I know just kind of went privacy. But sarcastically, because it's a huge thing. But how do you get you down in a way that they don't go, and for $12.99 you could buy this thing, which is what they want. They being the big machine, the corporation, the economic side of the thing, versus uh you know what you're interested in engaging in a particular landscape.
5 weeks to Strange New World season 2.
Yeah. So we just started watching Picard because I haven't had access to it until just now. So we
Oh.
just started
Have you watched
Picard.
the first season of Strange New World?
I haven't, and
Oh.
I'm going through and I'm doing. We just did the fabulous, marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and now we're getting caught up on the Star Treks.
Do Discovery before you do
That
Strange
was
New
clean.
Worlds, because it's
It ties.
yeah.
Yeah,
we start with Pike in Discovery.
that's the plan. But yeah,
I will make two comments on the AI end of this because we will revisit this. Number one, for a chilling, perhaps prognostication, Google Furby and ChatGPT, and hopefully it won't keep you up at night.
Or YouTube it.
Or you may YouTube it, however
Just-
you want to
just
search for your
however you
videos.
like to get to it.
And the second one is as I'm listening to kind of and thinking about our conversation, I'm amazed by how many things again come back to ambient findability. And so it's just such a fond memory. By the way, our first really big interview was Peter Morville, and when we talked about ambient findability. But even though that context was different, it was internet search. But of course, AI has evolved out of the technology and everything that was involved in all that. And it's interesting when trying to explain this to, well, in our case, in education, right, to students and what's actually happening with, in this case, largely text generators and that part of AI. And think about, those things about how the training is done, what it's really doing, how it's assembling answers, and, that whole set of concepts related to if the information's hard to find, it will hardly ever be found, and some of the other precepts in there. But I think that they're really relevant to what's happening. And so it's just interesting how that's remained, I think, a really important but small in size book, but really, I think, important.
well, the key word there that's very different now that I think is evolved immensely since that book was written is findability. Findability has the inherent presumption that it exists out there, probably in some sort of static form, and then I need to go find it. I need to interact. I need to do the searching. With the AI and the stuff we're talking about, it's going to say, "This is what you need to know." That we know about you, so therefore, this is the stuff that's going to be relevant for you. We're just going to let you know about it. So I don't know what the right word is. Not findability. It's dictated ability.
Yeah, but that's just it. Is that it doesn't necessarily know everything. So we still need, and we are still going to grapple with the massive amounts of information that we're generating now. And the AI will help afraid of is people thinking that the AI is the solution by itself. But that's again
We will
another
be
conversation.
defined by our pasts.
But the one thing I'm amused by, and this will come back out whenever we do talk about AIs, is that the focus here is on the large language model things, and that can be DALL-E, it can be the Firefly from Adobe, it can be ChatGPT or one of the other textual ones or one of the video ones. Nobody's talking about deep learning modules in Arc, even though it's using the same concepts. It's not the same exact technology, but underlying it is it's AI. And we're so comfortable with that from remote sensing and everything like that over decades of being in geospatial that it just doesn't even cross our minds in that conversation of AI a lot of times. So it's just, I don't know, it amuses me in a way.
Yeah, I'll save all my powder till the actual AI episode on that one.
Okay. You have powder?
Considerable.
Yeah.
On that,
I think that was part of the reason why we thought maybe we'd wait on it. That was part of the reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so it was you were saving it. It's not that you just didn't say anything. Okay.
Yeah. I have many thoughts and many things to discuss, and as does Barbara. I know. So I mean, there's a lot. I think we are going to have to. Jesse's absolutely right. We're going to have to do an episode, and it's going to be one of n number of episodes about AI, and in maybe this year alone.
Well, we keep saying that, but then we rarely go back to those multiple
I
episodes
think this one,
topics.
yes, but I really did want to. I'm excited to get back into the cultural landscape analysis game after having to focus on some other things, and so I think it was great to have this conversation as we get ready to kick off a couple of intense weeks of doing just that. And I think a lot of really interesting points, and I love how our thoughts ourselves over the years have evolved on some of these things as we practice some of this, as we've thought about how to take what we understand about landscape and try to translate it into that digital worlds, and think about all the ways that our understanding of landscape is changing ourselves as we again learn more, and then go out in the field and do some of it, and get some even more interesting insights.
As a quick wrap up, I just want to challenge our listeners to think about their own neighborhoods, their own towns, their own areas in a cultural landscape lens. It's very easy, relatively easy, I think, to go to a place you're not familiar with and think about that lens, but it's a little hard in your day-to-day lived experience to think about it in that way. And it's kind of fun to do. So give it a shot. You'll learn a lot about your area.
Of course, if you want us to add your event to the podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
You can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com.
Or you can reach me at jesse@veryspatial.com, or of course at Kinda Spatial in most places that aren't Twitter. Yeah. And of course, if you'd like to find all of our contact information, head over to veryspatial.com/contact.
As always, we're the folks from VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you on the flip side of Japan.